In the 2-bedroom apartment I called home, the screaming and shattered dishes never seemed to stop. Maybe for a few hours when Dad would glare at my mom, whisper some seething comment that made her wilt where she stood, and then storm out the slammed front door off to the local bar. My mom would sneer and aim her pent-up misery at me, muttering about how she wished she'd scrape me out with a coat hanger or drown me in the toilet during my first breath. They both hammered it in. I was nothing good except a tax deduction. Dad would return about 3 in the morning after the bars had closed, and it would start again. The yelling, the stomping and slamming, the slaps, tears, and shattered thrown glasses. I began reading to escape from it, getting lost in the words on the page. The books painted places I wished to fall into, along with my pattering tears. Everything seemed so wonderful in each world I'd read about. But after a crash of a thrown remote, the shattering of dishes, or a closed hand across a cheek with a meaty slap, I'd be ripped back into my miserable childhood. When the school began decorating for the holidays, we had an activity where we wrote Santa with a single request. It couldn't be a material possession of any sort, but a change we'd hoped to see. Mine came out through my shaky pencil on that lined paper before I even had a chance to think it. I'd blinked and read it with a surprise just as the paper was plucked from the cold desk. New parents, in small lowercase writing. The last thing I believed in was Santa, God being a close second, so I gave it no thoughts until the weekend. Friday night, my dad told me to pack some clothing as we were headed to the mountains in the morning. I woke early as the mist rolled down in blankets from the rain. It was a dreary day and I just wanted to hide in my room and read, but the glare I got when I'd shown hesitation from my father spoke volumes. He'd flashed those glossy red eyes at me, then squeezed my wrist hard until I feared it would snap as he muttered, "Don't make me repeat myself." I stuffed my ripped backpack with a few articles of clothing and brought it into the back seat of the rusty station wagon, which stank of cigarettes and bourbon. My mom held her head low, her dark hair covering her purple puffy eye. The engine roared and my dad flipped through the radio stations, punching the scan button with a fat hairy finger until country guitars twanged through his fuzzy signal, and we were off. We drove in silence, my mom's head frozen at an angle to view the world rolling by outside, unable to even face either of us. My dad chain-smoked, hotboxing the car with nauseating, tangy puffs that burned my eyes. I tried to suppress my cough, but one escaped, and his thick neck swelled as he turned, his red, pocked face staring intently at me, and his nostril twitched and lifted the corner of his lip with anger. I quickly looked down at my book, ignoring the car sickness which multiplied from the buzz of nicotine. Dad finally turned back to view the oncoming traffic past the rainy windshield. My stomach rose as the car leaned back from the steep incline, and soon autumn color peeked out of the haze. Lovely gradients of fiery reds and yellow decorated the valley. It was stunning. It looked like something out of the fantasy novel I was reading. I tried to ignore the clink of shells in the box under my driver's seat. My dad had brought his pistol and his ammo. I knew pistols weren't for hunting deer, after listening to the drunk threats so many nights. I knew they were for hunting people. "Remember this place, Barb? After speaking the vows that you so lovingly kept?" My dad asked in a question slathered in sarcasm that cut the thick silence. She just ignored him and lit a smoke. The small cabin came closer into view as we turned, a little log building with dark stained wood and dusty windows. Loose shingles jutted out, missing in places like lost teeth. A dark fence of rusting wood sagged and leaned around the perimeter. The car slowed to a halt in the wet leaves, and we stepped out into the mud as my father led us to the cabin door. He knocked a few times, then looked over the shoulder of his corduroy jacket before forcefully ramming the door a few times till it gave in with a thud. He stepped inside and my mother followed, then I. I knew we had no right to be there, even at that age, but I didn't care. I even liked the idea of something different. I hated being home, and even though the cast of our fucked up family sitcom was the same, the change of scenery was welcome. The cabin had a tiny room all to myself, and I unpacked the few articles of clothing I had with me, as well as the book I was reading, and my thrift store toy. I heard my parents talking and even laughing through my closed door. Later, we ate some canned pasta they'd found in the cupboard. I twirled the slimy meal with a fork as my father smiled and asked me what I'd been reading. He nodded his head, clearly not listening to the answer, focusing on the pressure he applied to squeeze my mother's hand until she squeaked a pained yelp. I ignored this, as I'd learned to. I'd only confronted him once before, and my mother then slapped me so hard she knocked me out cold. I awoke to my father throwing me through the glass pane of the sliding door. A bruised wrist and a dislocated shoulder kept me out of school for a week, so nobody would be the wiser. It was a week spent with them, a week without escape from it. I never made that mistake again. I hurriedly forced down the soggy canned pasta with an averted gaze, letting my dark bangs obstruct the view of their sadistic games, and I returned to my designated room to read as soon as I was dismissed. Out the small room's window, the peeking sun sank pink in a pool of amber behind the trees. I watched with teary eyes, until the magma on the horizon dimmed and the sky grew cold and blue. I kept thinking about the carton of bullets under his seat. I had an unshakable feeling I wasn't ever leaving these woods. The thought was interrupted by coarse shouting and vile insults spewing out just beyond the door. The silence between slaps and curses was even worse than usual, because they were something new. Long pauses of deliberation, of plotting, just waiting for some final push of a particular button. I covered my head with my pillow and eventually was able to fall asleep. I woke to the cold glow of moonlight on the wall when I heard the rustling of leaves, way too close to the window to the left of the bed. I gripped the scratchy blanket with small fingers and slowed my breathing to listen. I'd learned of bears and cougars, and the creatures from my book had filled my imagination with larger threats as well. Crunching twigs and rustling leaves told of movement. I pulled the dusty wool blanket up to my nose as a snap of branches sounded, and a large shadow entered the rectangle of moonlight projected on the wall. Someone or something had stopped and was staring in. My blood chilled as I pictured the homeowner back from a hunting trip and carrying a rifle, finding someone in his bed. Maybe it was a bear, smelling the easy prey just beyond the thin pane of glass. I swallowed and my heart beat fast as I watched the shadow. Eventually it passed the window and rounded the house. I laid there for what felt like an eternity until I heard the thumping heavy footsteps of my father, along with his muttered insults. A sliver of yellow light appeared under the bedroom door, and I heard his pissing in the toilet and mumbling. Then a door banged open.
"Who the fuck's there?"
My father slurred, and the pissing stopped immediately. Footsteps pounded along with a click of steel. I heard 2 deafening gunshots, then the clinking of empty shells on the floor. I covered myself fully and tried to vanish in the mattress when a deep guttural scream bellowed out, followed by a cracking, loud and crisp. The snapping moved through the cabin, farther away until it was outside the walls and deep into the woods. My mom's voice called out, spinning curses before her voice twisted high into a howling shriek. The loud cracks then started again, similar to thick branches snapping. But I knew as my skin raised from chills, it was the sound of breaking bone. Soon enough, everything was silent. I lay there shivering and didn't move until the square of moonlight on the wooden wall transitioned into a glowing yellow from the rising sun. I smelled the eggs cooking before I heard the sizzling pan from under the door. I lifted my head from my pillow slowly, and then nearly had a heart attack as a rapping on the door startled me. My mind raced through it all again and again, wondering if it was some feverish dream. I sat up in the small bed, stunned, until curiosity led my feet over to twist the doorknob open and look into the sunlit cabin. My mother sat at the table, a large, strange grin fixed on her face. My father stood hunched over the stovetop, his broad shoulders to me, as he flipped omelets in the skillet. Garlic, onions, and rosemary filled the cabin. It smelled amazing. My father never cooked before, not ever. My mother extended an arm to the chair for me to sit, and I felt every hair on my neck stand when I realized her black eye was gone. It wasn't makeup like she'd applied liberally after those drunken fights. It was simply gone, not even the slightest bit puffy. I walked over slowly and slid into the chair, peering over the edge of the table at the steaming omelet. My father turned from the stove and faced me, a broad, toothy smile on his smooth face. Too many teeth were in that slanted smile. His leaning jaw clicked into place as if it had just learned when it should hinge. My stomach twisted, but I sat down into the wooden chair, shaky and slow. We ate a meal like a normal family, or nearly normal. I ignored it when my father's hand would splay at the wrist by mistake, in a fanning distorted mass before observing mine and then trying again, properly at the base of the knuckles. I ignored it with my mother's neck folded down at a sharp angle with a muffled crunch, before fixing itself into an upright position. It was like they were learning, getting used to the new equipment. My gaze kept drifting to the long scratches on the floor and the single fingernail stuck in the splintered wood's path, to the red droplets splattered onto the beams, and the 2 shell casings nestled between the floorboards. I turned my head to view the open front door, a red handprint smeared on the wooden frame. Through the doorway, a trail of fallen leaves had parted to reveal drag marks leading to the lip of the ravine. I knew what was down there, waiting for the animals to pick apart the exposed meat and spread the bones to bleach in the sun. I knew, but I just turned to the 2 smiling parents, whose skins sagged a bit too loose, and I smiled back. Thank you all for listening. You like what you hear? You can check out other narrations and other videos I've done on here if you wish. You can also follow me on Twitter for updates, Instagram for pictures, and Twitch for livestream interactions. Also, don't be shy. Feel free to suggest any other stories you'd like me to feature on here. Have a good night.